Session three of the first virtual widening training of 2025 amplifies a central issue. What does public safety mean for people whose very presence in public could lead to arrest or deportation? To explore that topic, we're joined by Tandy Lau. Tandy is a Jersey City-based reporter who covers public safety for Harlem's Amsterdam News, New York City's oldest and largest historically Black newspaper. For the past 3 years, Tandy's coverage has ranged from NYPD practices and jail conditions to the migrant bus arrivals. His stories were used in a United States Court of Appeals gun control case and helped lead to the release of a young woman held on Rikers Island. Tandy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So I know that you've prepared some slides to sort of walk us through some of the stories that you have produced focusing on this issue. But before we get to those, tell us a little bit about your background and how you chose journalism.
Yeah, sure, of course. Thank you for asking. I am originally from Los Angeles, California. I currently live in Jersey City, as described in my bio, but work in New York City. So basically, for my entire life, basically, I've lived in a city where, lived in a city of immigrants, right? And I'm the child of two Chinese American immigrants. I'm second generation Chinese American. So Um, you know, uh, early on, immigration's always been kind of part of my life, and I think neither of my parents were immigrant. Neither of my parents were reporters. They were immigrants. They were not reporters. And basically, just kind of studied it in undergrad. And when I graduated, I kind of felt like there weren't necessarily places that I necessarily felt like my background as somebody who really cared about like Asian American issues, race. I had a double major in Asian American studies. Really, there was really a place. One of the biggest concerns that I had was like most of these entry level journalism jobs were very much focused on like places where you couldn't really talk about race, but because you were probably the only person that looked like the way that you did, your race would factor into how you would be able to do reporting and who you'd be able to have access to, right? So basically, for a while, speaking of widening the pipeline, for a very long time, I had basically freelanced and wrote about Asian American issues for quite a significantly long time in my early mid 20s, and meanwhile, I was working, was managing a furniture store, was kind of just trying to figure out next steps. Ultimately, that brought me to New York City, and basically after grad school, ended up going through Report for America, and they basically, I expressed, hey, I want to cover race and racism. I want to cover, I want to cover what, identity means to, um, identity's impact to reporting. So that ultimately led me to being connected with Amsterdam News. Ended up really hitting it off, and funny enough, I was living really nearby their offices. I didn't know that they were all working from home at the time. So um, now, fast forward 3 years later, here we are. No longer nearby the office, yeah, here in Jersey City. As you may know, that is a trek that a lot of people take in this housing environment here in New York. But yeah, basically, my background I cover public safety, right? It ranges from everything, right? Like public safety is a very broad beat, and I think especially for a smaller newspaper, it could really mean anything from housing, public health. I've covered numerous stories about rats in the city. I've covered. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Flacco the owl and like what it meant for his public safety to be eating rats and that had rodenticide. So basically, at a small newspaper, public safety is such a broad beat that really able to cover everything. And that's how really I got into covering immigration. It wasn't something that really was something that I was interviewing for or really was part of the job description. But we had like a significant like mass arrivals, and it happened to become part of my coverage.
You are one of the first, if not the first, Asian American reporter at Amsterdam News. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so, before we get to your presentation, talk about how that has sort of uh, deepened or broadened your own perspective of covering various, I mean, scores of different immigrant communities, or how you are received and how you navigate that.
Yeah, 100%. So I think I mean, kind of just to go back to like when I was I was in grad school, we had obviously all these conversations about race, right? Like in terms of who could tell whose story. And, at that time I was very like, I was very much focused on talking about like, hey, like I feel like the people who, are part of the community can talk, and I still firmly believe that. And then I, got the interview with Amsterdam News, and I started thinking like, how do I tell stories of another community, right? That was like obviously that was like a huge imposter syndrome moment. At the time, the editor was very like keen on hiring me and all of that, but it was like something that I was trying to figure out, and something I'm still trying to figure out. But I think through the last 3 years, one of the big ways, I think just broadly, even outside of immigration, that have been really kind of a sticking point in terms of my coverage of public safety is that, I mean, I'm really lucky to work in New York City where like kind of everyone has to engage with everyone, and Asian Americans have to engage with Black New Yorkers, Brown New Yorkers, right? Like everyone kind of has to deal with everyone. And that because of that, everyone's story is kind of everyone's, right? So through that, like I think it's really important. Like my experience has always been to not try to do stories that another Black reporter can do better, but to approach stories from how I as an Asian American reporter, Chinese American reporter, can potentially do that no one else can with the platform and background in the newspaper. So one of the big things that I obviously have done is a lot of Asian American stories that intersect with issues that we are covering. One of the big things has been the borough-based jails. If the people don't know, they're building a huge jail in Chinatown, and the conversation in Chinatown has only been about this big building, how it's going to mess up the neighborhood, and the conversation elsewhere has been like what it means to like close Rikers. So that's really what I felt like identity has really helped me in terms of working at a historically Black newspaper, being up until like a couple months ago being the only Asian American reporter in my newsroom, right? I think it's very kind of important to be able to dip into like who you are to kind of think of stories because, one of the big things is obviously in Chinatown, like it is just easier to be an Asian American reporter to walk in and ask some questions that you might not necessarily be the most comfortable talking about, right? And I think especially knowing kind of the stigmas within my own community to talk about incarceration, talk about public safety. There was that bigger benefit of looking the way I do and being able to speak Mandarin and be able to understand a little bit of Cantonese to be able to operate. And I think the same went through kind of our immigration coverage. Obviously, I think, the one of the big benefits of working with a newspaper like the New York Amsterdam News is because I think it is no, I think advocacy journalism can be a bad word sometimes in journalism, but I think we're known as advocacy journalists. So because of that, there is that trust that I think some communities might have for us to get it right. And I think that trust still has to be built and still has to be developed, but it's something that I think you have to kind of lean in on to kind of take advantage of sometimes because some of these stories that need to be told, our stories are kind of get kept because there is that concern with media. And sometimes, you might not necessarily have the relationship with the community, but because you have a relationship with an advocate or you have a relationship with people that have necessarily maybe, early on gotten coverage from the newspaper or really have a relationship with the newspaper, it's a little bit easier of a time to reach out to these populations to really get them to trust you and for them to know that you're not gonna do any harm with their reporting. I think that's been really my experience working at this newsroom. I think with stories in general, like across the board and not just immigration.
Thank you for sharing that insight. I
Yeah,
think
of
that's
course.
very important for the journalists to understand. So I'm going to turn it over to you now and walk us through some of your stories.
Yeah, of course. So I think, it's a good leading off point to talk about basically trust with advocates, right? Because one of the stories I sent you, Rachel, was basically a story that we got from an advocate that was not really keen on speaking to press because he was very much one of those guys that's like, I don't need to be in front of the camera to really do my work. I don't need to, like, it was one of those kinds of advocates. And actually, the way that we were able to get him to really work with us to get him to talk to us about this migrant soccer program that he was working on in East New York was because he was like a longtime advocate for other things, right? And basically, long before he was going to, the Port Authority to meet with, new arrivals, one of the things that we had kind of spoken about was him being in music videos. He was like this cameo guy in 90s hip hop, and basically we had learned later that he had basically there was kind of a little background. There was kind of like a lot of these music videos. He was like known as this guy with an afro. He would just like be in the music video. He wouldn't rap. He would just mean mug the camera, and then people would like point like it would be like "Where in the World is Waldo?" in '90s.
Before you go forward
Uh,
with that, let's set it up a little bit
oh,
better and tell
sure.
them the story, what the story was about,
Yes.
and then we can go on from there.
Yeah, I like so I guess you guys didn't get a chance to read it, but it was basically a story about a migrant soccer program in East New York, and basically it was basically organized. It was funded kind of just by small donations, and it really didn't have any press. It was just they were just taking migrant youth that were living in the shelters, giving them a soccer field to play on indoors. So this was like the story I think was like around this time last year. It was freezing cold outside, so you couldn't play in like a New York City park. But it was indoors. It was kind of safe environment. They had they had their snacks, they had their juice, they had their pizza, of course. It's New York City, right? And basically, it was a program that wasn't necessarily it was on the books, but it wasn't necessarily something that like these big advocacy orgs were really like championing. There wasn't any involvement with the city, right? It was something that was just going on kind of underneath the surface that I thought was interesting and I kind of came across my radar. So that's kind of like the background on that story. And I thought, why not make the trip out there, to go see what this program looks like. And then I was like, hey, do you guys have a photographer? They had a photographer. I'm like, great. I don't have to shoot on my iPhone. But basically, that relationship that we have with an advocate who didn't necessarily love talking to the media. I mean, he had a quote or two in like kind of some legacy newspapers, but he wasn't really looking for people to profile, his work. But unfortunately, that's kind of where you get attention, right? Especially with funding, with donations, with just getting people to join your program, right? So, um, we had talked to him, we had reached out to him, and he was like interested just because we had worked with him on previous stories, right? And he wasn't very interested in press. He wasn't really interested in, he was interested in like obviously talking about the struggles of raising money and stuff. But one of the big issues kind of he had was just generally kind of like the uses of the kids' faces, right? With the photographers, he's like a little bit worried about some of these people are going through their parents are going through their cases. Didn't really feel super comfortable having this publicly available knowledge, right? And we respect that, right? So I think one of the big things that we were able to pull off was to be able to have photos be taken with the kids' joy still very abundant and shown, but being able to kind of really make sure that none of this stuff would come back to harm them, right? Like obviously one of the big things that we always come back to at this paper is not to do harm, right? And I think what really kind of that opened the door to was other programs reaching out to us and really talking about what they want, what their plans were and what they wanted to do. But for this itself, I think it also allowed us to really talk about what was going on in these shelters, right? Like it wasn't just a story about soccer, right? Like the soccer was obviously like that was like the sugar on top, right? That was what the that was what we focused the story on in terms of content, but it was an opportunity to really talk about like the issues that were going on in the shelters, right? One of the big things that we learned from just standing around and talking to parents and talking to like the couple advocates that were there, were that like parents were having trouble getting groceries that they could actually cook, right? They were giving out credit cards. I'm sure many of you guys heard about um, these credit cards that the Adams administration were giving, and there was a lot of kind of backlash from other kind of talking heads about it. But in reality, like they couldn't really take advantage of it because you could only really use it at certain places, right? And they didn't have kitchens in these shelters, and we learned about that. And it was really an opportunity to really get some of these stories told that I think otherwise wouldn't be told in a very kind of um, in a very kind of feel good way, I guess, without making it fluffy. So that's kind of like one of the stories that my editor likes pointing to. If we have time for another example, I think um, in a more kind of like I guess sad angle. There was a recent, death a couple of years ago of two young men, young boys. They weren't men. They're young boys that were, I think they were middle school age or they were just approaching high school. And basically, what ended up happening was we found out that one was Black American. He was from Harlem but went to school on the Lower East Side, and then the other was from I believe he was either from the Bronx or he was not from Harlem, but he was going to school in Harlem, and they were good friends, but they weren't classmates. They didn't grow up in the same neighborhood together. One was Black American, one was from Guinea, West Africa, and basically both ended up falling into the Harlem River, and unfortunately their bodies were recovered. And I think during then was really when there was a conversation of how we want to properly cover um, immigrant communities because there was a lot of reporting that was very much divisive of the two communities. Obviously, um, both of them were like very, 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 very high achieving students. They were all both very young. It's a very sad story, but I think there was also this conversation of like what happened, right? And it was a public safety story in that regard. Um, but what ended up happening was a lot of that reporting fed into this narrative that split Black American communities in Harlem with the African communities that lived on 116th Street and in the Bronx. And that conversation got kind of ugly at times. Like obviously, I don't think any of it made it to the into into the media, into any of anyone's reporting, but we saw a lot of contention between the two communities over this. One of the big kind of rumors that I think was pushed by one of the outlets was that the Black American child, who was, I think he was like 6'4", he was a big kid, had accidentally pushed the other child into the river, and that brought like a lot of contention. So that was really where we started thinking of like how we could do less harm in reporting like that. And one thing we found out was the child that was from Guinea, West Africa. He actually had a dad that was out of the country that had actually gotten deported, and his dad obviously wanted to send off his son, see the body, have a proper funeral. They're Muslim, right? So they didn't want to wait, but he couldn't get back into the country, and that's where we really started thinking of really how you could do less harm because we realized that immigration is really it's such a multifaceted story, and we also figured that one of the things that we also realized during our reporting when we went to the funeral, the other child was the father was incarcerated, and he could only see his child for like a couple seconds. He was in prison greens while the corrections officers that were escorting him were in like really dapper suits. And we thought that that was really important to point out of how like, you know, despite the division that was kind of caused by the stories of this, that there was very common ground between what Black Americans were going through in terms of not being able to really properly send off a child, right? That the worst thing that can happen to a parent, and um, the same thing happening for an immigrant who basically had to go through deportation. We kind of like looked through kind of avenues of like how it could have. Ultimately, it never happened, right? But we thought that that would probably be the best way to approach this big Harlem story about Black New Yorkers that's going in our backyard without kind of feeding into the narrative. So hope those two examples kind of show a little bit of how we've kind of adjusted our reporting on immigration and just generally how we approach things at a smaller newspaper where we people don't necessarily read us for day-to-day coverage for daily news coverage. They really like want to learn about the world that's around them, and I feel like that are my two favorite examples of how we do that.
Extremely powerful examples. For me, as an African American, when I think about first the connection to the continent and how we think about reporting on it, just very creative and powerful. So thank you for sharing those. I want to talk a little bit about the issue of sourcing when it comes to, for example, I think the top of mind way people think about this issue is, are communities worried about deportation? Are they
Mhm.
worried about someone coming in and, into a school or into a church? What strategies or what conversations have you had at the paper about how to get people to talk about this issue, or how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult thing to navigate, and I think I think especially now as you know since this turning of this year, um, people have been on higher alert. Like unfortunately we haven't had with what's going on in New York State, we haven't had the same ability to cover immigration the same way that we have during the migrant situation, where that was the big story, headline story for. So because we're a local news outlet, one of the things that we definitely have to be very, very careful of is just how our reporting is being used, right? And this might not necessarily be an immigration example, but one of the things that we definitely have thought about when we talk to law enforcement is to make sure that people aren't reading these stories to necessarily do harm in the communities, right? Whether it's about gun violence prevention, right? We don't want somebody reading my story about the iron pipeline and ghost guns and learning where to find instructions to build a ghost gun. That would be the exact opposite of why we are doing advocacy reporting, right? So the same goes towards immigration. So one of the big things, obviously, is when we kind of redid our one of the biggest concerns I had when we redid our um, kind of style guide. We for a very long time kind of were very kind of it was kind of like Scout's honor with our style guide. Obviously, we went through AP and obviously SBJ, but in reality, we were a little bit more liberal with the use of anonymous sources and protecting people's identities, right? Like if I needed it, I could just do it and tell my editor later, and that changed with this new style guide, and that became like a big concern because I it's much easier to be able to promise somebody when they are talking to you, hey, like how do you want to be described, right? Rather than being like, let me talk to my editor first, and let me make sure that this is okay. But thankfully that hasn't been an issue. We've been still very, 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 very delicate with people's identities when they need to be protected to make sure that no harm falls upon them. I think one of the big things that we also I think actually need to do, and I think it's something that as reporters it seems counterintuitive sometimes, is really having to protect our sources, right? Because I've had people just tell me about their plans and the things that they've heard and the things that they feel like they can do that might be technically breaking the law. And I think that for me has been one of the biggest challenges is when you do get a source that really trusts you and that really just likes talking to you. Sometimes I think there is that there is a concern of like making sure that you're not going to do harm to them, right? Because I mean, there are stories where I'll describe somebody, and if you know, I mean, if you dig hard enough, there is a possibility of finding out who that person is, right? Just if they're somebody who works as a doorman in downtown Brooklyn, then you could kind of surmise like where they're exactly located, who they are, right? And obviously, that is a big concern, right? So I think the biggest challenge I think I've had in terms of making sure that we properly report a story, making sure that our reporting is good and the story is good and it's responsible, is also making sure that sometimes the information is given to us that we don't want to ever stop a source from talking to us and giving us everything we want to know, but we want to make sure that they know what our job is, who is rating our newspaper, right? Because we do have elected officials, we do have police officers, we do have, I can probably imagine some immigration officials rating our stories, right? So protecting our sources, I think, has been the biggest challenge and the biggest, I think, conversation that but with other reporters that cover immigration, right? Because it is just a horrible feeling, like right to like even think about like your reporting like backfiring on somebody that you wrote on and that not being your intention, right? So um, for examples of how I've kind of been able to do it is really trying to talk on background. It's, obviously, especially I work through a translator a lot of times. I'm like, it is very difficult to explain what on the record background and off the record is to somebody who like to when it's like already really, really difficult to explain it in English to, the average English speaker. So like to have somebody have to now go through a translation, like go through a filter and try to explain it to someone else, I think is kind of terrifying sometimes. But I think that has been really, 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 really important. And, for them to understand, like, really what our jobs are. And even as an advocacy news journalist, like, we still have to be factual. We still have to, be fair, right, to everyone, including, agencies that we were trying to hold accountable, right? So, because of that, making sure that they know what our job is, knowing the kind of basics of it. Because I mean, most people haven't spoken to a reporter in their life, right? Like this is probably the first time, right? And even if it's not, it's probably the first time talking about what they've gone through, right? So, um, you know, you want to make sure you pair up that friendly face with, um, you know, an actual reason for them to trust you, I think is the best way to put it.
That's a great way to put it, actually. I want to pivot here before I open it up to questions
Mhm.
to a discussion of that term advocacy journalism, or
Mhm.
maybe just the
Yes.
word advocacy, because 40 years ago when I was starting out, that word could have gotten fired literally by an editor who thought you're too close to the issue. And as I've told these fellows and other fellows over the past couple of years, when I started, my first job was in Clearwater, Florida, and the Black community of Clearwater, Florida never made it to the newspaper. It was invisible. And so when I raised my hand and said, I want to cover it, the response was, well, that they don't read the newspaper and they don't buy our ad, so we're not going to worry with it. So, anyway, long story short, uh, often that word can be used as sort of a club
Mhm.
against us because we're told we're too close to the community or we can't be objective or whatever. So I want to ask you about your role at the Amsterdam News, your role in reporting stories, finding out what's happening in communities, but the sense that some people have this weird feeling about advocacy journalism. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm glad that you asked about that because actually, the first time I ever did like an alumni event, the moderator who had was like my media law professor back in the day, he was like, aren't like you know that the Amsterdam News was regarded as this like anarchist. I forgot the way he described it, but he used the word anarchist, and he kind of he said it in a very like disparaging tone. Like it was not a nice way. He was not an anarchist, and he was not, and we are, to be clear, not an anarchist newspaper. But and that was like the first time I think I had talked to somebody that was outside of the Black and brown community about the newspaper that had knowledge of it. And this guy was, I think, a reporter for some time, but he at this point was a lawyer. He was a media law lawyer. He was white. He was affluent. I think he made all the. I think he's a millionaire. Is my understanding. But that like I thought it was interesting, like the way that he kind of talked about it versus when I talk about the paper with somebody who grew up in Harlem, who kind of sees the paper not as advocacy news, but just as a newspaper of record, right? And a little bit of background of the newspaper. It's been around for 115 years. It changed hands a couple of times, but even before the prior ownership, the story was very much kind of one of the first places the last civil rights leaders, including Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, were published. I believe it's actually the first place that Malcolm X was published outside of his own kind of newspapers. So there's a lot of kind of history behind civil rights with the newspaper, and I think one of the biggest kind of knocks on it was because it was very close to the issue, right? Because we would be publishing these people that are now kind of objectively seen as, historical figures that were on the kind of the right side of history, right? Even amongst kind of these quote unquote non-advocacy outlets, right? And legacy news media, right? So um, I think it's really important to kind of point back to, I'm sure for those who went to J school, like I'm sure you did a case study on the Central Park Five. And I think it's always good to point back to this case because a lot of times we look at what the media did wrong back then, because obviously there was a lot that the media did wrong, right? They published the names of alleged youthful offenders. They, obviously they used words like savages, animals, wolf pack, right? Like that's all stuff that we studied. Um, but I think on the flip side, one of the things that the Amsterdam News kind of did was push back on that. And that was one of the reasons why we have this kind of trust within the populations we cover. And that's one of the big reasons why the Exonerated Five still speak to us regularly and give us exclusives to this day, because we advocated for them, but at the end of the day, that on an objective level, that was really, looking back on it as like from a journalism studies perspective, that was probably the actual thing to do, was to not publish names of youthful offenders, was not, or alleged youthful offenders, was not to call young men wolf pack or savages or animals, right? Like, and back then it was seen as advocacy, but the question was when you call like a group of young black and brown teenagers, right, those terms, isn't that advocating for something else, right? You're advocating for their incarceration. You're advocating, of course, beyond the fact that they were innocent, right? If they're guilty, that language is very much advocating for something, of advocating for what people think about, right? So I think it is interesting. I tend to like to call it advocacy news in kind of traditional journalism spaces, but I think at the end of the day, I mean, we still have to report the facts. We still have to be accurate. We still have to write corrections if we get something wrong, right? Um, but at the end of the day, we see race as something that you can't really avoid. We don't think that there are two sides to racism, right? And as a public safety reporter, like, you know, I see my colleagues that work outside of advocacy news. They still, like, when they write about murders, they don't write about both sides of the murders. They don't write about how a murder could, pro murder and anti murder people just write about how murder is bad, right? People write about how rape is bad, right? And there is that difficult conversation of whether or not you could say the same about racism, because it's a much less tangible thing. It's much more, it's there is a different understanding of racism that I think academics have towards kind of how the general public has. That definitely makes sense. But I think for our newspaper, for a paper that we're all reporters of color writing to communities of color, I think it's not something that we can avoid in our reporting. So it's a long way to kind of say that obviously this word advocacy journalism is a very weighted word, and there are going to be people who are just going to disagree with how we approach our reporting. But I think that in a way, and this goes back to very J school, that it's very difficult not to advocate for anything, just the language that we use, just who we imagine is reading our stories, right? All of that in a way is a level of advocacy, right? Even if we follow these kind of traditional conventions in journalism. Um, and I think I think one of the big things is just denying that um, kind of traditional model towards serving our audience, serving our populations, and writing against these kind of conventions in journalism that we felt like were the same conventions that why an Amsterdam news needed to exist, right? Because because of segregation, Black Americans needed their own newspaper, right? Because of police brutality in the 60s, they needed somebody to actually cover these wrongful arrests and like police roughing up suspects in Harlem because it wasn't being covered by legacy news, right? And that's obviously, like you said, it's a choice, right? There are publications that just because they don't think that our readers are going to be their readers, that they're not covered as much or in a way that I think we believe would be necessary to properly depict and tell stories of a community. So I
Tandy,
hope that
I
makes
have to,
sense.
I just need to jump in here because I think you have offered me an extremely powerful take on this issue that even though I've been in the business now about 40 years, it's a powerful way to frame it. And that is when you report on something that is, the example you gave, the people calling the Central Park Five young men savages and whatever. What are you advocating for? Are you advocating for discrimination and hatred towards various groups? I mean, that's how it could be interpreted. And so, particularly in this moment that we find ourselves in now, um, anyone who wants to sort of say, reporting on immigration or threats or whatever is advocacy, um, flip the script, shift the prism on the lens on the whatever, and realize that when we cover these incidents and when we cover the outrage or the upset that people have against immigrants, are we advocating for something? It's a question. It's a question that we need to ask. Are we advocating for something negative or whatever? Um, I don't see any hands. Are there any questions? Okay, we've got a question from Chloe. Go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm with Al Jazeera English. I'm an associate producer with them. My question is related to what you were talking about with protecting sources. Um, and so a lot of the times when I do anything that like is protecting the sources, either taking information on background or even sometimes offering anonymity in like pretty extreme cases, um, I then balance that out with like a ton of data just to like there's no arguing here, like yes, this is a person who's not giving their name, but also there's a lot of data to support it when covering specifically like migrant communities and immigrant communities. A lot of the data sometimes is either inaccurate or really difficult to find. So I guess I was wondering kind of two questions. One is on the topic of like how do you find some of this data, or just I guess more like quote unquote like official information, like non-interview based information. And then second question is like how do you balance that in your pieces? So like how do you balance more like quantitative and more like human parts of your stories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think this conversation about data with migrants is very interesting because a lot of this kind of debunking of like a migrant crime wave, right? And it's something that we definitely have avoided in our newsroom is there's been this very significant focus on like both sides to use data to prove whether there's a migrant crime wave or whether there's not. And we just don't know, I think, right now. It's, like we've looked through the data, we've looked for, and because one, New York City doesn't take, immigration status when they arrest somebody, and obviously some their charges, not convictions, right? It could be very difficult to prove whether or not there is any difficult change. But obviously, the way that we kind of go back to it is find previous historical data, right? We have historical data in our own newspaper, 115 years, right? There has to be something, right? But also there are other patterns, right? Like we know that in previous patterns of immigration, we know that migrants are more likely, asylum seekers are more likely to be victims of employment crimes than they are to be perpetrators of like violent crime, right? That there's data to back that up. But I think it could be tough to be very confident about that because we're not talking about the same populations. And I think it can be also sometimes reductive to be like these are very different populations because it's not just about what they've um like these populations on like where they came from and who they are, but it's also like what they're going through, right? Because if they aren't getting services, if they're being kicked out of shelters, like some of them have been in New York City, like um, their outcomes are going to be different, right? And I think that's something to think about, right? When you're using kind of historical data and you're using previous stuff, is that like what sort of different outcomes could happen because of how we're approaching this wave of immigrants differently, right? And it could be, something that you're not going to ever find numbers for until, maybe, decades later when there's finally a study that happens that properly and comprehensively does this, or it's something that, you get an investigative team to do and properly lay out after months and months to look at. Um, but I'm glad you asked that because one of the biggest challenges of covering this has been that there isn't really that much reliable data. And you definitely don't want to talk to the city all the time about this because the city is telling us that it is going great, it is going amazing, right? And that's just not the case from kind of what we've seen. There's been a lot of things that have come up, right? That kind of lead us to believe that migrants are going through a lot that is not going so well through kind of the way that the city is approaching it, right? So, but my advice a lot of times, and I think this is where the anonymity can be a barrier, is to really focus on like the individual, right? Because even that person you talk to that you might just have to use a first name and blur their photo out and kind of or use a different way to describe them, or right, even that person's experience, I think, is really really critical. Now fact checking can be tough, right? Because the shelters, I don't know if you are familiar with covering New York City, but New York City is a black box with almost everything. Like public records requests, like the things that I filed when I was like just starting the job are like barely getting to me now, right? And the NYPD is a black box. Like the crime stats are very, very, very difficult to understand. They're always telling us that crime is going down. I'm like, they're always telling crime is going down. They're always telling us that crime is better than it was in the 90s and the 80s, right? So it is sometimes I think it is really critical just to sometimes be able to fact check what you can in terms of the individual and really hone in on what the individual is going through. And maybe the best way to do it is to talk to multiple individuals, right? Because if multiple people from multiple different shelters or humanitarian emergency relief, that's what we call it, humanitarian emergency relief, response relief shelters, like if multiple people are saying this and the city is like sheepish on it, then there is some smoke, right? And if it's something that you're having difficult fully being able to fact check, then go with what you know, right? There's a story somewhere, I think, with what migrants are going through that doesn't necessarily really need this broader data that might be misleading anyways, if that makes sense. And to be able to tell these stories through what an individual is going through and what that process is like. And, I think that could be, I guess, I don't want to say like a shortcut because it's a lot, I think it's a lot of work, but that could be a way to like fairly do it while protecting this person. But at the same time, like, being careful with what the data that you're given, because even data that might benefit their argument sometimes might be misrepresenting them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank
Any
you.
other hands? So I'm
Yeah.
going to jump in here until we have another question, and that is, I'm thinking we have such a broad range of fellows from different parts of the country, et cetera, different urban type areas, et cetera. But I wonder if there's a need to keep a proper context on the impact of policies in immigrant communities in a city like New York versus Des Moines or versus Macon. One of our fellows is, I believe, from Macon. So give me your thoughts about how this issue might differ from various regions, if you can.
Yeah, so like I said, obviously one of the big things is I've lived in a city of immigrants my whole life, but I'm not under the illusion that that's representative of most people in the country, right? So, um, that's something that I've always kind of thought about is like if I ever leave New York City, like how would I be able to cover, not just immigration, but just anything the same way? And I don't think you can, right? I don't even think you can really cover the five boroughs the same way. I live in Jersey City. I definitely don't think you can cover Jersey, even though it's literally a 20-minute train ride away. Like I don't think I could cover Jersey City the same way that I cover New York City. So, in my opinion, I think really being somebody that lives in that community, and I think that goes back to like advocacy, right? Part of it is your identity, not just as a person of color, not just your sexuality or your religion, but it's also, who you are, right? You live in this city, and that gives you or town, right? That gives you a strong understanding of how you how your audience receives your reporting, what reporting is needed, and what sort of things are overweighted in terms of importance, right? Because one of the big conversations I think a lot of reporters that do cover rural communities have told me is like I don't know why people care about what's going on the border when I'm when we're on the other side of the country, right? When we're so far up north, there aren't really any asylum seekers living here. Why are people concerned about this? And I think that's something that only the reporter can really answer. But I think a lot of times that comes from you as somebody living in that community, right? Like, why is this important? And it could just be that like it's on TV all the time, right? It could be that like, there's like an uptick in crime and there's a lot of like specious misinformation, right? As a Chinese American, one of the big things is that like we have our like, there are Chinese American social media sites like WeChat where a lot of misinformation is being spread. But that could be a story in itself. I believe that if anything is really interesting is like why does my city that is not in a border state like really care about immigration, right? I think that is sometimes a story in itself, right? And I think part of it is just putting yourself and putting yourself and your community into why this story matters, right? Because sometimes we just do stories to do stories, and that was one thing that I think as I've gone on in the Amsterdam news, I've had a little bit more freedom to pitch my stories that we've really wanted to avoid is you don't want to just do stories to do stories. You want to do stories that are going to provide your readers with some sort of vitamins, right? With some sort of, you don't want it just to be junk food just because it's something that's on social media, just because other national outlets are covering it, right? Um, and I think that's really here in New York City. Why is it important, right? It's obviously we have an influx of migrants, but even on the granular level, right? Like there are people in the community that have a general misunderstanding of what an asylum seeker is, right? They have a fundamental misunderstanding of what an asylum seeker is, and they need to kind of have that understanding. And, I think that has been really why we do these stories more so than anything else, because I mean, our reporting is all in English. It's not translated, right? So it's focused specifically on a Black American audience, even though we hope that other Black immigrant populations, generally everyone in the city reads our reporting. We are under the illusion that it's for like we're gonna be writing to another audience, like another significant audience. So really to make sure that they get what they need from our reporting, right? They understand what's going on. They know what an asylum seeker is versus somebody who is undocumented, right? Like what DACA is, what all of that is, right? So
You have
that could be,
actually, I'm
uh,
sorry to interrupt you, but
no,
you've
no, no.
highlighted such an important challenge for media today in general, which is community communicating to
Yes,
communities why they should care about these issues.
yes.
That's so much a part of the big challenges for journalists when it comes to covering immigration, as you say. Some people are like, I don't have that problem in my community, or
Yeah.
there are no others where I live, and so why should I care? We're winding down here, so I want to jump in. I see a hand. Alicia, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Tandy. I'm Alicia Brown. I cover reproductive rights at States Newsroom. I'm based in North Carolina. I was thinking about this question when I saw your clip about how social media fosters divide within or between Black and Asian
Yep.
communities. Of course, that's something that has been going on. Like I know you mentioned you're from LA, and I think about the horizontal hostility in the 1990s, early 1990s, in between those two communities. So. Given your position at New York Amsterdam News as the first Asian American reporter there, which is awesome, but I know you also talked about, whoa, experiencing imposter syndrome, right? Have you ever dealt with apprehension from Black communities as a reporter? And if so, how do you foster trust? Maybe in a way that maybe you may not experience, like when you talked about covering the new possible jail in Chinatown, but also don't want to be presumptuous. Maybe you also um, deal with some distrust there just because folks are distrustful of the media. But yeah, hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned that story. I didn't realize I actually shared it, but it was kind of like if it's okay, I'm going to go a little bit back on my last point, which was basically like that story. Basically, I kept seeing like stuff about like Black on Asian crime, and then like it was constantly being sent to me on social media. I had to delete some of like my mom's channels on her WeChat or whatever it's called, like to make sure that she wasn't getting all this misinformation. But that was like, that's what happens, right? Like, I was like, why is this constantly a thing? And is it true, right? And that's really where that story came from. So that's one thing that you can think about, right? Like, why do people in rural communities care? Like, if they don't live, in a border state, right? But I think kind of to answer your question, and I hope I'm answering it correctly, is basically being kind of Asian American, I think I have I think not necessarily from sources. I think the paper has been really helpful in that like people grew up on the paper. It was passed around. People have memories of the paper in a way that I think I'm never actually going to be able to fully comprehend because I didn't grow up with it. But it's been really beneficial for me to be able to, and that's why we really need these kind of older, minority-owned publications because they have that relationship with the community that maybe the other outlets don't. But I think maybe the question that I think I had gone on a Chicago radio station. I think it was like an iHeart radio station, and I was there to talk about I don't know if you're familiar with the Jordan Neely Daniel Penny story, but basically that was, it was a big national story about a white Marine killing a black unhoused man on the train after he was having a mental health episode. And obviously, being in New York, we covered that. And I had gone on, and we had a guest who came on and he was I think his focus was on like black fatherhood and stuff like that, and he was asking me, he thought I was Vietnamese and I was like no, I'm Chinese American, and he's like, what would you know about these issues? And I think I had to take a pause, right? Because I think obviously, I think one, I think he was coming at it just generally on like this very anti-Jordan Neely thing. So I came on to talk about it from an element of like how race was taken out, right? From there, and he wanted to kind of talk about something else. So I think when I was like kind of asked about that, I think it was like really the first time I had like actual like pushback on being like an Asian American working at like a black newspaper because this was somebody in Chicago that didn't really know anything about the newspaper, right? And I think that conversation, where that conversation really steered, was the idea of New York City, right? Because like that story kind of shows, like you can't really step out in New York City without seeing both a Black and Asian person, right? Like you're like if you take the train, you're gonna have to engage with every so I think one of the things is going back to kind of advocacy news, like stories about Black New Yorkers and about their issues are stories that are not only about New York, but I mean, it's the biggest city in America and it's the biggest, like they are just American stories of national interest at times, right? So, I mean, to kind of, I hope I'm answering your question correctly, but um, it's it's definitely still something that I'm trying to figure out the perfect way to do it. And I don't think there's a perfect way to do it because I don't think there's any single way of covering a community properly. And I think, especially if you're covering a community outside of yours, I think it is obviously going to be something that you're going to have to work 10 times harder. And not only that, though, it's also something that, when you go back to your own communities, you're gonna hear stuff that because you work in a different community and everyone you engage with is in a different community, you hear it and you're just like, wait a minute, like this, like you almost have to sometimes have to relearn how to interact with your own community because when I went to Chinatown, some of those things that were being said, I would like, I had to question, right? I had to be like, is this something that Chinese Americans believe, or is this something that you believe? Uh, about jails and stuff like that. There was one guy that told me that like nobody from Chinatown was gonna be incarcerated there, and I was like, I totally disagree with that. And I don't think that that's true, but I think that really, from my experience, I think really the importance of having kind of these old 115-year newspapers really help when you have that imposter syndrome because when you go to a community and you say, "Hey, I'm from this newspaper," there is a little bit more trust that you would have otherwise, and there is going to be there. I haven't really gotten pushback, thankfully, because of the newspaper. I definitely think it's because of the newspaper more than anything else. So, and I think that's really why it's important to have that relationship as a newspaper to know that you're not going to do harm, right? Because if there are people who the Amsterdam News has pissed off, and they might not push back on me being Asian American, but they're going to push back on what the newspaper has done to them, right? So whether or not it was justified or not, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Tandy, you've
absolutely.
given me so much to think about
Oh,
in
that's
in
helpful.
no, in the here's how I frame it. You have helped me to realize and probably better articulate the fact that immigration, covering immigration is an American story.
Mhm.
In a fractured nation, when people want to other everybody
Mhm.
other than themselves, I think what all three of these sessions, but certainly this session is helping me to remember that I need to be able to articulate that this is an American story. This is America. This is our America, whether you like it being this way or not, or whether you what color you are or whatever. That this is the American story, and I want to thank you so much for your insights and for your stories and for being now a new member of the NPF Widening family. So thank you, Tandy Lau of the Amsterdam News, for being with us. I greatly appreciate it.
And thank you for just sharing an hour with me. I hope this was enlightening. I definitely feel like I've learned a lot. Like I said, I think, obviously this is just one way of how to cover immigration. And obviously, I hope that this gives people to think about. And obviously, if you want to keep in touch, please share my information. Love to connect. If you're in the New York City area, let's grab a coffee and let's talk about how we could, really tackle reporting from kind of the things that we talked about.
And you should all definitely click on Jesse has added his the story about
Yes.
the soccer team program. So
Yes.
please do all of you check that out. And we will be in touch. So never fear, you will be bugged by me at various points over the year. Thank you, Tandy.
Well, absolutely. Thank you and have a great Monday. I know everyone's starting their week now, so best of luck with all your stories this week.
Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.